A lot of what we've been told about heart health isn't necessarily accurate because it fails to take into account the health of the mitochondria. Stay tuned to today's episode to find out more. Welcome back. My name is Sarah. This is the Sarah Kleiner Wellness YouTube channel, and today's guest is Dr. Stephen Hussey. He is a repeat guest. We are going to discuss his book, Understanding the Heart, and his own personal journey of really understanding what causes a heart attack or a stroke. Now, he actually experienced this himself firsthand, as well as went through the allopathic medical system to see how patients are treated that have a heart attack. He's going to talk about his story and how he's been able to heal himself and continue to help patients in this journey as well. Of course, we're going to talk about high-fat diet and heart attack, but I think what we talk about with stress and mitochondrial health, you'll find the most interesting. So enjoy this episode with Dr. Hussey. There are going to be timestamps linked down in the show notes for you. And I want to thank two sponsors of today's episode before we jump into the show. The first one is going to be Viva Rays. You can use my code YOGI to save over at Viva Rays, my go-to source for circadian glasses. Now, one of the things Dr. Hussey and I talk about extensively in this episode is the importance of circadian rhythms to your mitochondria. So this would be a fantastic product if you're looking for a way to protect your circadian rhythms. Check out Viva Rays. Again, my code there is YOGI. The second sponsor of today's episode is going to be Optimal Carnivore, a wonderful way to fill in any nutritional gaps if you have them, which most people do. You can use my code carnivore uppercase Y to save 10% over on Amazon. That is going to be linked down in the show notes for you. I used them during pregnancy, after pregnancy, before pregnancy. They've just been a fantastic way, again, to fill in those nutritional gaps. Thank you again so much for watching today's episode. If you do enjoy it, give it a thumbs up and make sure to share it with friends or family members that need to hear this advice, especially if you are worried about their heart health. Please do share it. Thank you so much for listening. Let's go ahead and get into today's episode. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. I'm excited to have actually a repeat guest. I think Dr. Hussey's been on maybe 2 or 3 other times, but I think it's been since 2021 since we last chatted. So here we are 2 years later. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. And, when we had first talked back in 2021, well, let's back up. So there's like an evolution of us chatting. So first we were both really kind of into the carnivore diet, that movement. And I wanted to talk to you about the cholesterol and all that stuff. And then when we chatted in 2021, it was a little different. You were kind of coming out of that a little bit and exploring some deeper topics. And now I'm super interested in talking to you about the heart and fourth phase of water and structured water and all of those things. So it's been like a pretty interesting evolution to see you, how you've come along. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to me, obviously, because it's personal, but I feel like it can help a lot of other people. And so that's why I'm sharing it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, I don't think we really even talked about it in our last interview because I think you were still just kind of wrapping your head around the whole thing, but you actually experienced a heart attack, correct? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. In January 5th, 2021. I had a heart attack.
Yeah. I don't know if you're comfortable talking about that,
yeah, sure.
That whole deal. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the first part of my book talks all about it. And I actually did a talk at Roanoke College here locally about that. So if people are interested, for more details and things like that, they can do those two things. They do the book and that talk on it, which is on my YouTube, which is Resource Your Health. But so I'd spent a lot of my life, trying to prevent heart disease because I was heavily predisposed to it as a type 1 diabetic. I've been type 1 since I was 9. And, the theory is that your body attacks the cells that make insulin and that, I don't make insulin as opposed to a type 2 diabetic that is making insulin but not responding to it. So I have to inject insulin to my body. So I'd spent a lot of time trying to figure out heart disease and what caused heart disease. And I'd actually pretty much finished my book, Understanding the Heart. And I was going through, just like a lot of people during that time, it was a stressful time because of all the changes from COVID and things like that. And so, yeah, but I had some very stressful news happen to me, a close family member, about a day and a half before the heart attack. And so, looking back, and everything I know about, stress's effect on the heart, and stress's changing of physiology, I'm fairly certain that was the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, when that happened. So, there's all this evidence, that type 1 diabetics are heavily predisposed to heart disease. But, I had a CAC score, coronary artery calcium score, done 6 months prior to my heart attack. And it was 0. There was no calcification in my arteries. Doesn't mean that there was no potential soft plaque or whatever in the arteries, but there was no calcified, which for a type 1 diabetic of 25 years is pretty good. And there was actually a study that just recently came out that showed that when you have a CAC score of 0, that whatever your LDL cholesterol is doesn't matter. It doesn't predict whether or not you're going to have a heart attack or not. And I would say that regardless of what your CAC score is, it doesn't predict whether they have a heart attack or not in general. But that study, associational study, showed that. So, yeah, I was going through, stressful time, and then I had that stressful news, and then a day and a half later, I woke up and I was still stressed about this news, and it was the inability to do anything about it, which made it the most stressful, because research shows that stress that makes you feel like you're in an unpredictable situation or out of control are the most damaging to health. But I woke up that day, and instead of kind of like, mindfully paying attention to that, I tried to do the same thing I always do, which was a very, vigorous workout. And I did that morning, and, about 30 minutes later, I got tightness in my chest and had a heart attack, 100% blockage. Just a spontaneous kind of clot just formed, because of, what happened, and it totally blocked my left anterior descending artery. And so, I called the ambulance, took me to the hospital, and I survived, which, it's a widowmaker heart attack. So less than 12% of people who have those types of heart attacks outside the hospital, like they're not already hospitalized and they have a heart attack in the hospital, but people who have them outside the hospital, only 12% survive. And so I was lucky. And it's one of those times where you're just like, yes, Western medicine, like saved my life in that situation. And so it's one of the useful benefits of Western medicine is they can do amazing things like that. So I'm incredibly grateful for them able to do that. And so I'm sitting there in the cardiac ICU and thinking like, I'm a hypocrite, I can't release this book. I was very, doubting myself, very demoralized. But then what happened over the next 3 days in the hospital showed me how off Western medicine is in understanding the heart, and understanding what, how to keep the cardiovascular system healthy. Even though I wasn't able to prevent that, all the information I just researched in the book and all the studies I just read and all the, philosophical approaches I thought about and everything, it was just the complete opposite in the hospital. They were telling me eat a processed food diet. They had no idea that the heart is not the main mover of the blood. They were pushing medication after medication after medication on me, even though I brought up, the potential side effects, and does someone my age and my health status need that, or they weren't really explaining things to me. And so I just kind of saw firsthand this disconnect that I knew was there, but now I was experiencing it firsthand. And just a lack of communication between, that was the worst part of all of it, was that when I would bring up things that, sharing my opinions with my physicians, they would shut down the conversation. And I was like, well, that's the biggest problem in healthcare, is to shut down a conversation. You're not even open to discussing a potential different therapy or different approach. It was your way or the highway, because you've got 5 or 10 minutes with me, and that's what you need to say. And so, it was just, it kind of reinforced that I need to get this information out there, because even if I wasn't able to prevent, a heart attack, it doesn't make any of the information different or incorrect. And in all honesty, the way that we find the truth is by talking about it. And so people need to know the information that was in the book, even if some of it's wrong, we need to talk about it. And the shutdown of conversation was the biggest issue. And so I released the book, and so we can open the conversation and actually find the truth.
Yeah. So they were really just pushing medications on you. They weren't really talking to you. They weren't looking at your overall health. It was just like, this is what's happened. So you need to take statins, and what other types of things were they trying to push?
Yeah. I mean, I had, I think 11 or 12 different medications prescribed to me in the hospital. A couple of blood thinners, a couple of blood pressure medications, definitely a statin, different other things that weren't like long-term stuff, but just like, this is going to help you prevent clotting while you're laying in the bed, and this is going to calm you down. They provide the Xanax, and this is going to, I forget what else they have, but yeah, a lot of different medications while I was there. And I would question them, and I did end up taking one medication for about 6 months, which was a blood thinner, because there's a stent in my heart now, and I don't know how my body's going to react to that. And so while the artery was healing around that stent, I took a blood thinner, but I stopped it as soon as I could, and didn't take anything else of those other ones. They told me that I have to be on a statin the rest of my life, on blood pressure medications the rest of my life. They told me that I'd have to take, and I was wanting to know why. I was just like, I understand what these medications do, but what's the reasoning as to why you want me on them based on your assessment of me? And nobody would tell me. They would just say, oh, because, that's what you do. You've had a heart attack. It was cookie cutter approach. This is the recipe that we give people. And so I was just like, well, I want to know more. And I had to basically, beg someone to, and I wasn't being, I don't think I wasn't being like hard to get along with or whatever. I was just, bringing these things up and questioning, wanting to know more information. I had to beg someone to actually come in and explain what they found on my echocardiogram. Like, tell me why you want this, right?
Yeah.
And then once I did get some information, and I really didn't get that information until I requested my records after I left the hospital, and they were sent to me, and I saw in the records what they were thinking. I was like, oh, okay, I guess I understand why they did that, or why they wanted that, or whatever. Doesn't mean I'm going to do it, but I understand now. But yeah, they wanted me on the blood pressure medications because they wanted to prevent heart failure, because there was damage to the heart. And I was like, oh, well, I know how to prevent heart failure, with infrared sauna and taking pressure off the heart and things like that. So I was like, I'll do that instead. I kind of put together this heart healing, I guess, protocol of my own. And I guess the people want to know, like, how am I doing now? And it's like, well, I've fully recovered. My echocardiogram said that my ejection fraction of like the amount of blood that leaves the heart was down to like, I think like 25 to 30%, which is supposed to be like 50 to 70%. And now it's back up to 55. So within 3 months I did that. And then there was tissue damage to the middle of the tissue between the two ventricles, the septum is what they call it. There was damage, and it was akinetic, meaning it wasn't communicating the signal of, like, when your heart sends a signal to beat, it sends that signal through all the muscle there. And mine wasn't getting that signal right after the heart attack. And then 3 months later, it was 100% better. It said it was akinetic at first, and then it was mildly hypokinetic at 3 months. So I assume that it's 100% better now, but because I'm doing fine. But yeah, so things 100% recovered, and I didn't do anything but take that one blood thinner for 6 months, and anything they said, and then I did my own kind of heart health training, which I spoke a lot about sauna, but I started using it much more regularly. The biggest thing I did was manage my stress, and incorporate more things like the gratitude and just perspective and things like that. Getting things or mitigating things in my life that were making me feel out of control and things like that. And those were things that I had gotten away from or hadn't been paying attention to as much. And so yeah, that's kind of that story.
Yeah. And I just find it so interesting that they wanted to put you on so many different things, and they didn't really have a reason as to why, other than it's just like kind of like what we do, because my mother is somebody that has been chronically ill since I was around 18 with cancers and various things. And the list of medications that she's on is like literally this long. I mean, anytime she has a health problem and we have to go through the medications, it's like pulling out a book. And I'm always like, why? Why are we on all these different things? What is this for? And that's how healthcare works, is we just put you on things and say you have to be on it for life. And we don't look at the lifestyle at all. And so I think that it's important. We have to look at those too. And I want to talk to you more about sauna, but the big question I have that I know other people are going to have also, and I'm sure you've addressed this at length in your book and in different various talks, is the role of the saturated fat and animal fats in the diet. Now, you know me, even though I'm not doing carnivore diet, a lot of my diet is high saturated fat. I think it's healthy. It helped me through my pregnancy, is like getting me through postpartum, haven't lost a bit of hair, nothing, feeling good. And I feel like that it's an important nutrition piece, but there's going to be a lot of people out there that say that's what caused the heart attack, was the saturated fat. So have you changed your diet? Have you changed your views on diet? Like, what does that look like now for you?
I haven't really. So I was doing a carnivore diet for a while, and then I'd say probably 6 months, about the time I had that CAC score done, before the heart attack, I went back to eating more plants. I just incorporated them back into my diet. And I did it like a little bit at a time to see if there was a certain plant toxin or something that was having an effect on me.
Right.
And I didn't really see too much. I mean, maybe lectins from nightshade vegetables had a little bit of an effect that I saw, just like post-nasal stuff or whatever. But yeah. But my diet's been high in saturated fat for a long time. And, going back to like that study that I talked about, where it was like LDL cholesterol is not a factor if you have a CAC score of 0. I would argue that it's not necessarily a driving factor regardless. But that study, associationally showed that people with 0 CAC scores, tracking their LDL was pointless. It didn't predict whether they were going to have a heart attack or not. So this saturated fat piece, I mean, without going into the whole history of which history is very important, of how saturated fat cholesterol were blamed,
right?
Which when you go into the history of that, when you go into the history of that, you start to realize, well, we never really had any proof that it caused an issue in the first place. So now we're in the situation where it's the conventional wisdom, and there was no real proof for the conventional wisdom. And so, and yet we're having to try so hard, like people like you and me are having to try so hard to convince people that this should not be the conventional wisdom. Yet we're having to provide more information than was ever provided before that it was. It's just kind of this weird situation, which is kind of how humans are, I guess. But yeah, so the history of it. And so, but now there's studies coming out showing that, there's really no evidence for this. Wow. We looked at everything. There's one that came out in 2020 that basically said the ideas around saturated fat are overblown for when it comes to heart disease. And so, but it doesn't make sense philosophically either, that right. this fat that humans are mostly made up of and been eating for millions of years, humans and pre-humans and things like that, is now all of a sudden causing disease. Right. That doesn't make sense. Like heart disease, modern, like the amounts of heart disease that we're seeing have only been around for like 100, 150 years, maybe. And so it's like, it can't be the thing that we were doing this whole time. It has to be something else that changed. And what changed for me is it's just the modern way of life. We started eating way more processed foods. Within the last 100 years, vegetable oils were driven into the food supply. The amount of stress from modern day living, just talking about quantum stuff, just like the light totally changed. Now all of a sudden we have all this artificial light, thanks Thomas Edison. But yeah, just all of this, our entire like toxin exposure, from the Industrial Revolution and then the technology revolution, where like our lives have just totally changed. And instead of studying those things, we're blaming heart disease on this thing that humans have had around for millions of years. It makes no
Mm-hmm.
sense whatsoever. And that's just a philosophical like look at it. But then you look at the evidence and you're like, oh yeah. And I share a lot of this evidence on my social media. It's just like, oh yeah, there's plenty of evidence that your circadian rhythm is very important, that endotoxemia is very important, toxin exposure, stress is very important. Like all these different things that have been thrown off because of our modern way of living are way more important. And there's way more evidence behind that than there is behind consuming saturated fat.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have to ask yourself, people are like, well, why is everybody talking about saturated fat? It's like, well, it serves a purpose for certain industries to blame saturated fat. They can make more money, prescribing pharmaceuticals or telling you to eat this certain diet, which is way more profitable for the grain or sugar industry. And there's a lot of, funding and influence behind that. Unfortunately, that's just how capitalist society works. I sometimes I have to choose to believe that it's just the result of a capitalist society, even though there probably are more nefarious reasons for it.
Mm-hmm.
I choose to kind of, think that way. But yeah, so, the other thing is that saturated fat is incredibly important for human physiology, incredibly important for our brain, for our nervous system, for, making of just delivering energy, but also like, if you look at saturated fat versus polyunsaturated fat, and like, just as one example, like the red blood cell, if it tries to make itself up of phytosterol, which is, plant fat, which is more polyunsaturated, it becomes very rigid and it can't bend or flex through arteries or capillaries when it gets small. And that can lead to damage to arteries and stroke, which, I talk about studies that show that. Whereas saturated fat is what our red blood cells are supposed to be made up of. And so if it's made up of those things, it becomes flexible and it can bend a little bit, and it's much more functional, I'd say, for the human body. So that's just one example of where saturated fat is what we're designed to be made of.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, evolutionarily, like you said, it really doesn't make sense. And I think 2020 kind of woke up a lot of people that said, oh, there's this, why are these people saying these things? Why are we being told this? And I think there was a lot of bad stuff that happened that year, but I think at the end of the day, a lot of people now, their eyes are a little bit more open to, why is there a narrative around our food? Why is there a narrative around plant-based? Why are people talking about eating bugs right now? Why is that a thing? And because follow the money, and I think you're right about that, but it's just, God, it's the brainwashing is so intense when it comes to saturated fat and heart disease. And I think that's the biggest thing that I get questions about. Oh, my cholesterol is this, I'm worried about this. And I'm like, what are your triglycerides? That to keep it simple for people, I'm always like, well, what are your triglycerides? And if they're not over 150, I have people with beautiful triglycerides, and I'm like, well,
yeah. Well, if like you said, take the background of like, so like in 1984, I think it was, they put together, or they had this meeting to decide if cholesterol was good or bad. And they incorrectly, in my opinion, decided that it was bad. And so then they put together all these committees to teach physicians to how to lower cholesterol and things like that. And so pharmaceutical companies got wind of this, and they went and they funded those committees. And at first they decided that an LDL cholesterol should be 250 or lower, right? Which is way higher than what we think it should be now.
Yeah.
And so over the years, what we saw is that the pharmaceutical companies come in and they fund and influence these committees to lower that recommendation. So then it went down to 200. And then over the years, it went down to 150. And now it's supposed to be 100 or lower, is what they want it to be. And so all that was funded by pharmaceutical companies. And the conflict of interest there is that they have a drug that lowers cholesterol. So of course, the lower the recommendation for what LDL should be, the more drugs will be prescribed. And so they had a direct conflict of interest there. And so when you see that kind of stuff happening, you're just like, first of all, it makes me think, well, we have no idea what LDL cholesterol is supposed to be. We're just shooting in the dark, and it's being based off of what we have drugs to treat for. So it throws, but you're right. People have woken up and they see things like that now, and they're just a little more skeptical of these recommendations, or they do their own research, which is a good thing. It's bad that we had to go through all that just to get to that point. But yeah, it wakes you up a little bit.
It does, definitely. And I guess just jumping back to how the sauna and
Mm.
the heart. I'm curious to hear how that is helpful for your heart.
Yeah. So some background information for this. So we have to talk about water, which is one of my favorite things to talk about.
Yes.
Because we're always told, oh, we're 70, 80, whatever percent water. We're a large percent water. But if you think about it, if I'm a large percent water, I don't slosh around like a waterbed. So clearly I'm not, most of the water in my body is not in the liquid state, right? So I can take the tissue of my forearm and kind of move it around, and it's more like a gel. It's kind of like Jello. I can push it and it gives, but then it comes right back, springs right back. It's kind of like Jello. I can still puncture it though, just like Jello. I could put a needle in it and puncture it. So yeah, most of the water in my body is in this gel type state, which has been termed the fourth phase of water, or exclusion zone water, or structured water, or whatever you want to call it. And so that becomes very relevant when we talk about the cardiovascular system for a few reasons. One is because when water holds energy, which it can get energy from the earth or from infrared light, or even even loving emotions from somebody, you know, and the electromagnetic field that sets off from someone, you can absorb that from someone else. When it holds energy, it structures itself into this fourth phase water. And so the water in the blood, which is the blood is about half water, when it gets next to the lining of the artery, which is a hydrophilic surface, a water-loving surface, it structures itself and becomes this gel state. And they've shown this from Gerald Pollack's lab, and they've shown that it does do this, and that does two things. One, it helps protect the lining of the artery, and then also it helps blood move. And to me, it seems like the main way that the blood moves. Because of how structured water forms, it creates a very electronegative space where the structured water is, and electropositive space in the middle of the artery where all the excess hydrogens are. And so if you can imagine a bunch of little positively charged hydrogens floating around in the middle, like the like charges repel each other. And so there's a bunch of positively charged hydrogen trying to get away from each other, and they keep moving in one direction, trying to get away from each other, and they end up creating this flow of fluid. And they've shown this in Gerald Pollack's lab with, you know, hydrophilic tubes placed in water, and how it just starts to flow without any force acting upon it, as long as there's energy provided to the system. And then he also showed this with in chicken embryos, how the blood continues to move because of the structured water in the lining of the artery. And so that becomes very important for heart failure. But before we get to there, it also, the reason they call it exclusion zone water, or one of its names is exclusion zone water, is because it excludes most things that are not it. So it becomes this barrier, this impenetrable barrier for most things. And the only things that can really penetrate it are small hydrated ions. And so there's a reason that if people think about, I don't know how advanced your listeners are, but if people think about a cell and how a cell concentrates potassium in the cell, and chloride in the cell, and sodium outside the cell, there's a reason that happens, because the cell is mostly structured water, and hydrated potassium and chloride can penetrate structured water. They can get in through the cracks of it. Whereas hydrated sodium, that kind of seems to be the cutoff point. It's too big. It can't get in. And so that becomes very relevant, because people think, oh yeah, cholesterol causes heart disease. Well, guess what is way too big to penetrate structured water is a cholesterol molecule, way too big. So our bacteria, our blood cells are all way too big. And so even the smallest protein found in the blood, albumin, is way too big to penetrate structured water. So if we have intact exclusion zone water lining the artery, then it serves as a protective layer. Unfortunately, there's things that can break it down, which we can talk about if you want, but that's what structured water does, is it protects the lining of the artery. And there's evidence that shows that infrared sauna, like infrared light, which is the most absorbed energy by water, it seems, 3,000 nanometer wavelength specifically, then when it energizes water, it structures itself. Infrared sauna has been shown to increase the health of the lining of the artery, increase nitric oxide production, which is which is what, you know, the lining of the arteries do. Those endothelial cells, they produce nitric oxide, which creates a healthy lining of the artery and allows the artery to expand and contract and function like it's supposed to. And so that's one thing we see. But also, when I talk about the flow of blood, you know, that means that the heart is not necessarily the reason the blood is flowing. It's not this forcefully pumping thing. It does do a little bit of pumping, but no more than is enough to get the blood through the chambers of the heart, really. The rest of the movement of the blood is due to this mechanism of force-fed water on the lining of the artery. And so that makes us think about heart failure. If we're blaming, this inability to move blood and swelling in the limbs and things like that on the heart, and it's not doing its job. Well, what if the heart's job was never really to move the blood forcefully? What if there's other mechanisms that do that? Then we have to pay attention to maybe those mechanisms are breaking down and forcing the heart to do more quote unquote pumping than it's supposed to do.
I hope you're enjoying today's episode with Dr. Hussey. As a reminder, his book is going to be linked down in the show notes, as well as all the timestamps. If there's a particular part of this episode you find interesting and want to go back to it, please utilize those. And those are going to be brought to you by one more sponsor today, Upgraded Formulas, my go-to source for understanding your mineral levels. A hair tissue mineral analysis is actually going to show you what's been going on in your body over the last 60 to 90 days, whereas a blood test can really only tell you what's been going on this snapshot in time, what's happening today. So if you really want accurate information about your mineral balance and then how to fix those mineral balances, check out Upgraded Formulas. Use my code YOGI12 or YOGI if you have already used that one before. Thank you again for watching today's video. Make sure that you check out that information section for all of those amazing links. And let's go ahead and get back to the show.
So the thing that really drives this home for me is that when you look at the research with infrared sauna, exposing the body to infrared light, and people with heart failure, it's amazing. People with heart failure have, their ejection fractions increase tremendously, which is, the amount of blood leaving the heart. The swelling goes down, the changes in the heart structure, like the swelling or kind of the ballooning of the heart, it goes back to normal. To a normal sized heart. And so this is all just infrared sauna therapy, Wow. And so it really drives home the fact that the blood is not supposed to be moved by the heart. It's supposed to move by other mechanisms. And when we upregulate those mechanisms, the heart takes pressure off the heart. So when I was sitting in the hospital and they're saying, okay, you need to take these blood pressure medications so that we can prevent you from having heart failure to take pressure off your heart. I was like, oh, well, I can do that in a much better way.
Right.
And so that's what I did. And yeah, I did not develop heart failure, nowhere even close. So, there's also evidence that infrared sauna, helps the heart muscle heal, along with carnitine, which is a nutrient found in animal foods. It's really important for helping heart muscle heal because, the reason heart attacks are so serious is because the heart cells can't divide and regenerate and create new tissue. They have to heal what's there. And so yeah, that's why infrared sauna is so important for heart health. And I don't understand why there's not an infrared sauna in every cardiac rehab center everywhere, but there should be. But then it makes you think, okay, well, what was the original infrared sauna? And that was the sun. 40% of the sun's rays are infrared. But also, just grounding and doing different things that promote the structuring of water, promote the energizing of water, is what we should be focusing on. And that's what's all around us. It's nature. It's all those different things.
Yeah. I mean, what I've heard is that sunlight striking the skin, the UV light can expand that easy water by up to 4-fold. And so when we talk about the body being made of water, I know it's like 99% water molecule because everyone throws around the 60, 70%. But when we actually talk about water molecule in the body, it's more like 99%, so how could these things not be supportive to the heart and supportive to that blood flow in the body, right?
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. And the more you learn about water, the more you realize, I think that it's driving everything. It's what's, I agree. It's literally like, it's the thing that is holding the information in our bodies. And I was reading Albertson Georgie, one of his books, and he made this statement that it made me think like, and it was that, if you think of things evolutionarily, there were fish at a certain point, and there was even before that, there was smaller, smaller multicellular organisms. And, the ocean is like this aqueous solution, this salt, this salty solution. And it wasn't until we realized that we could, flip things around. Instead of having the salt all around us, we could then capture the salt in us and carry it around, that we could go to land. And so life evolved once it learned how to keep the salt within us and the water within us. and then take it out onto land with us. And I was like, that's a really interesting notion. Like we developed this skin that was able to trap it and take it with us, but we still have to keep it healthy, which is what does ocean have? It has all these minerals, it has sunlight on it all the time, it has the earth in contact with it all the time. And like, that's what we need. We're basically little oceans walking around, and we need to tend to our oceans and make it more like an ocean. And in that light, there's a big plastic island out in the middle of the ocean, and that's not taking care of the ocean. So we don't want plastic islands in us either. So that just, goes into like the whole toxin exposure and how that interferes with a functioning bag of salt like we are.
Exactly.
Salt water.
And then, you mentioned things being able to penetrate into the cell. I know calcium is one of those things that can really cause all kinds of issues. I've been studying some of Dr. Martin Paul's work in regards to non-native EMF and then even just like stress. So maybe can you break that down a little bit for people who are like, what's the problem with flooding my cell with calcium? Like,
yeah, well, so your cells are supposed to function in a certain way, and that's what it's kind of I don't know, evolved or what the way the cells kind of evolved over time is that it's supposed to have, like I said, this concentration of certain minerals inside the cell and certain minerals outside the cell. And that creates this normal homeostasis, right? And then if we find, so the structuring of water inside the cell is largely what creates that barrier. Because like I said, there's like this thing called the Hofmeister series of hydrated ions, and the sodium potassium between those two seems to be the cutoff. Sodium, anything hydrated ions of sodium or larger, magnesium, calcium, whatever it may be, are excluded from the cells more or less. And things like potassium or smaller, everything down to like nitrate, can go into the cell. Because I get the question oftentimes, it's like, well, the lining of the artery makes nitric oxide, and how does that get through the full? Well, nitrate, which is a precursor to nitric oxide, is one of those things that can penetrate the fourth phase water. And so thinking about that, we have to maintain this kind of system more or less to maintain health of the cells and proper function of the cells, because that helps maintain the structure of water of the cells. It helps when we have that structure. It helps for the transport of different things through the cell, getting nutrients to mitochondria and different things like that, proteins and things like that. So all that's very, very important. And if we mess with that, then we can get dysfunction. And so one of the things I talk about in my book is how the whole idea is like how the heart rarely gets cancer. Right. And there's certain things that characteristics of the heart that I think help prevent that from happening. But at a fundamental level, it's the ability of the heart to maintain this type of cellular state, right? So what do we need to maintain fourth phase water in the cell? We need energy, which the cell makes ATP, and ATP is not necessarily this energy currency that drives all cellular things. It really unfolds proteins, which gives water the structure.
Right. I think the water is what's driving the energy. I don't know about if you agree with that. Yeah.
And the ATP is just there to unfold the protein so that the water has a surface to structure itself on.
Yes.
And so once the water is structured, then we get this situation. And so, but that doesn't mean that certain things can't change, or they call it like a phase transition. It can't change the state of water temporarily in order to get a desired effect. Like people think of like an action potential of how your nerve communicates a signal somewhere, or even muscle contraction of how the muscles contract and send that signal along the muscle. So there are certain things that can, I don't know, break down the fourth phase water momentarily to get a flux of different things into the cell and then back out of the cell once it forms again. And so that's what's kind of driving physiology. However, there are things, it's kind of a long-winded explanation to get to your point. There are things that can, instead of making that a temporary state where structured water goes away and comes back, it can be more permanent. And that's what we don't want, because then we get this dysfunctional state, right? And so things that can do that are a poor metabolism. Let's say we get damage to mitochondria. They're not making enough ATP. They can't unfold the protein. Structured water can't form. That's a big issue. Also, we can get different toxins that can penetrate. And I don't know, I was reading some things earlier that that made it was kind of scary to me, that there's things like polyethylene glycol, which is antifreeze. It can actually penetrate fourth phase water, it seems, experimentally, which is a problem, because that's a toxin that's in our environment. Some people say it's in certain pharmaceutical things. But yeah, so there's that. Glyphosate's another one that seems to be able to destroy fourth phase water, right? Yes. And then you talk about non-native EMFs, we knew for a long time that they had a detrimental effect on cells, but nobody really knew what the mechanism. But then, like you said, Dr. Paul kind of figured that out. He showed that what it does is that, they said like it opened calcium channels, but it really didn't do that. What it did was it destroys the fourth phase water, and that causes this flux of calcium into the cells, which can be very toxic to the cells. Because remember, it's supposed to have this ion distribution of what it's supposed to be. And so yeah, that's why those components that I talk about, the correct metabolism to make enough ATP to unfold proteins, the right energy to your system so that water has enough energy to structure itself when it gets next to those proteins, proper electrolytes, having those electrolytes there so that, the hydration of the cell can happen, because you can drink all the water in the world you want, but it's hydrated ions that transport the water into the cell and bring that in there like that. So it's those different things. And then you step back and you that was like on a, cellular level to me, it's kind of a beautiful thing, because you step back and look at it and you're like, well, what do I need to what environment do I need to put my body into to create that situation? And, I could learn all the science I wanted to and get all these biochemical pathways or whatever. But when I step back and think about what environment it is, it's things that are real. Like the real things. It's the sun, it's the earth, it's human communication. It's things that are real. Like those are, because, to a sense, we understand the body in a sense of hyper reality. It's almost like it's so small, it's hard for us to really fully comprehend. So there's always different theories, and some of them I think are better than others, but it becomes this state of hyper reality. And hyper reality is kind of like the Weather Channel. We tend to take the green blob moving across the screen as more real than what's happening outside. Yeah. And I remember I was driving somewhere and it was raining outside, and I was like, oh, I'm going to check the weather to see if this whole drive is going to be in the rain. And so I checked the weather and it said it's not raining. And I was like, it's definitely raining outside. And I'm driving through it right now. And so that was just like, oh, this is a hyper reality, right? We create this. And so when I think about, what the quote unquote science that maybe hyper reality tells me, it's focused on things that are real, things that you can see with your senses that create health, the things that are real in front of your face, not this artificial biochemical pathway that tells me this supplement is good for me, or tell me this pharmaceutical is good for me. Like those things they're hyper realities that we create. It doesn't mean that supplements don't help, like, because they can in certain situations, or even pharmaceuticals in certain situations. Those things can be helpful, but the overuse of them and the basing your health philosophy on those hyper realities, I don't think is ever going to work. Because no matter how we try as humans, we're never going to fully understand, the human body. And so what's focusing on what's real to a human body, that's what's experiencing for millions of years, seems more logical to me. I don't know how I got on all that, but yeah.
No, I love it. I love it. Cause I was just having this conversation with a group member of mine. She's like, I'm just so exhausted with trying to heal. I read all these papers and listen to podcasts and follow all these different people. And she's like into like the functional medicine world. And I'm like, I invite you to shift out of that paradigm and look at your health through the lens of quantum health and circadian biology, because it's just going to free up a lot of your head space, and it's going to free up a lot of your heart space and head space, and allow you to just get back to, again, what's real, connecting with the earth, getting sunlight on the skin, setting your circadian rhythms. It's so much easier to look at your health through this lens than like, I have to do this specific diet and eat these macros and take all these supplements and this, that, and the other. Not to throw all those things and trash them out and say they're useless, but if you can shift and have a new paradigm, a new way of looking at your health through this lens, it's so much more relaxing And it just makes so much more sense. It really does. So
Yeah,
that's
it's
why
way more real.
Yeah. Yeah. I love talking to people like you who can talk about how this relates to us in the framework of our heart health, because I think that's what people need to hear is like, not take 2 milligrams of this, that, and the other, and then, do this routine. It's like, no, go outside barefoot, get some sunlight on your skin, understand these quantum health principles, and you're taking care of your heart.
Yeah. And, and then people, some people just want the science, and it's just like,
Right.
okay, well, that's fine. But, in a sense, science has become a hyper reality too. The medical science, it's all designed and carried out by humans, which is it's always going to be imperfect. So
a lot of the time under blue light in a laboratory.
Yeah. Right. And I talked with Anthony J a lot about this. At one point,
Dr. J.
Yeah. We were talking and he was just like, most of the research on myocardial cells, like heart cells, is done in a petri dish of glucose solution. And we know through the evidence that heart cells prefer fatty acids for fuel. So it's like, we're just totally skewing any result we get because we're putting these heart cells, we're taking them out of their natural environment. So how can we really even understand, if anything, taking them out of natural environment, but then we're putting them in an unnatural environment of a glucose solution rather than fatty acids and ketones. And that's just another issue to think about in general is science itself is fundamentally flawed because it tries to eliminate all the variables. And I don't know about you, but I'm never exposed to one variable at a time. It's always multiple things always happening at the same time. And the other thing is that in studying, and I don't know if this is going to be helpful, people are just going to confuse it maybe more. And so I apologize if it does, but it's just like in studying anything, you have to make sure that the process of studying it didn't alter the thing you're studying. Yeah. Which pretty much makes it impossible to study anything. Because if I just want to go say, oh, well, I'll do that. I'll just go observe things in the woods and study them. Your very presence in the woods is changing the natural way of things, the whole thing, right? Yeah. So it means that we'll never really find the answers, maybe, but maybe we're not supposed to be thinking or finding those answers. Maybe that's not supposed to be. I don't know, but it's just interesting. And I say that because if you look at the way that we study cells, we take a cell out of its natural environment. So we extract it from tissue or whatever. And then we put it through a blender. So we slice up the cell so we can see a cross section of it rather than the whole cell. And then we stain it and we put it under unnatural light to view it on the microscope. And we do different things to it. And we say, look at this. Okay, this is how a cell functions. We're looking, it's like, no, that's how a cell that's been taken out of its natural environment, sliced up, stained, that's how that functions. I don't really know how a real cell functions. Right. And we don't have a technique right now developed to study how a real cell functions or be able to see that. We can see whole cells on a microscope, but to see inside them is different animal, different techniques. So we don't necessarily have yet. So yeah, just interesting ways of thinking about things. And I say all that because it makes me say, okay, well then humans may never figure that out, or while we're figuring it out, the best thing we do is focus on what's real, like what's actually real in our environment, what creates health, what makes sense. And so that's what I try and do.
I agree. I love that. And I think it's just another reminder for people to kind of get back to, did your grandparents do it, or your great grandparents, did that make sense for them to do that sort of thing? What kind of health did they have? And I've talked to so many different people who kind of observed older generations that didn't grow up with the cell phones and didn't grow up with this indoor life where we're so dependent upon technology. And yeah, a lot of them have health problems, but we're having these alarming rate of heart issues, brain issues, just alarming rate of health issues in the younger generation. It's getting younger and younger and younger. And again, people are trying to point to the food, and they're not at all looking at the environment. And I always say, like, if there's inflammation or there's illness, it's someone's losing energy to their environment. And we need to look at that also,
Yeah. And so, yeah, in my book on the heart, I started out with this idea that, at first life was like this, single cell organisms. And then at some point, those single cells learned how to use oxygen better. And there's ideas about how mitochondria were their own thing and they came into the cell, and that helped the cell use oxygen. So now the cell didn't have to focus on life so much because the mitochondria was doing that. Now it could focus on becoming multicellular organisms. And, life continued to evolve and, higher and higher functioning organisms. And I guess the story behind that is that it was all about energy. It was all about, I think, an Earth getting energy from the sun and needing it, and it becoming too energetic. That's why we see all these, there was all these volcano eruptions and all this stuff during that time before earthquakes and all that stuff. There's too much energy concentrated in the Earth, and the Earth needed a way to concentrate some energy in other things so that it could not have that stored energy. And so that's where life came from. Cells started storing energy, and then the mitochondria came in and helped those cells use energy more. And then that became more and more multicellular organisms. So basically our job, life, the purpose of life is to hold energy and utilize it. And then dissipate that energy back out into the environment eventually, which is thermodynamics, the second law of thermodynamics, things toward disorder. And so I could call poor health disorder. Your body's not utilizing energy. It's not absorbing energy the way it's supposed to, holding onto it and using it to maintain life. It's disorder. It's not able to do that. And so your body is breaking down. It's not functioning properly. And so that was almost like you could say that was the purpose of life to begin with. It's why life evolved, to help the Earth hold on to energy. So that it, didn't go out into the Earth and the Earth didn't have this unstable environment, and so it's just an interesting kind of idea that helps hopefully people understand that it's all about energy. It's all about your body's ability to take in energy from different environments, the sun, the Earth, whatever, and then utilize it properly through healthy mitochondria that are going to, help structure water and make you this energy utilizing super being, so
absolutely.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the important thing is that we're taking care of that water network in the body. I think that that's the underutilized thing. You and I both kind of came from like carnivore world, and like that was like the thing, that was the ticket. And then I think after a while we're like, well, wait a second, there's so much more to the function of the body, and the diet's important. Saturated fats are super important. The meat is important. All those things I think are important to function of the mitochondria, function of the water network in the body. But if we can kind of like zoom out a little bit and view the body a little bit differently, I think that it kind of takes the pressure off of us to be on this, perfect diet all the time, right?
Yeah. And what is the perfect diet? One of my favorite lines is the diet that healed you may not be the diet that's right for you the rest of your life, which is completely true. And it's the key to diet, I think, is not being dogmatic about a diet.
Right.
Because, like I said, I mean, there's lots of people that, go from a standard American diet to a vegan diet, and they're like, oh my gosh, it helped
so much better.
So much things helped. This must be the diet that's best for the rest of my life. It's like, well, no, eventually you're going to be deficient in things. And the same could be for a carnivore diet. It may not work for you the rest of your life. And it's just not being dogmatic about it, being wise enough to step back and say, okay, well, let's change things a little bit as my body changes, as my environment changes, as I get older, different things, realizing that life is dynamic and not static, and just paying attention to those things.
Yeah. Food is just another form of light and another form of electrons. We're supposed to get just 1/3 of our energy from the food, and the food contains the light code of what time of year it is, where we are, latitude, all of those things. That food is information of I'm in Georgia, it's January 31st. There's only certain things available to me that have the light code here. I shouldn't be eating something that's from Mexico at this time.
Exactly. I think it's
a confusing signal.
Yeah. The freshness of the food too is also going to dictate how much energy that water in your food has. That, if it has energy when you're eating it, then you're consuming energized water that will structure itself when the time comes, it gets in the body and does what it needs to do. But if your food's coming from halfway across the world, it's not going to have much energy left by the time you eat it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, we have to start shifting our paradigm, I think, to view things differently.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to ask you, what is someone who's watching, they're concerned with like keeping their heart healthy. What would you say is a heart healthy routine for someone?
Yeah. So in my book, I talk about 3 different imbalances. I talk about metabolic health. I talk about inflammation stress, oxidative stress, and then I talk about balance in the autonomic nervous system, which a large part of that is like, quantum or circadian health. That is one of the benefits of that. And so those 3 imbalances, I think, are driving most chronic disease. Really, I just centered it around the heart in my book. But yeah, so a diet that creates metabolic health. And that's not just a diet of nutrients.
Right.
Think about light, think about emotional health, all those different things influence mitochondria, which is what creates metabolic health. Is your body, are your mitochondria healthy, and are they producing, the amount of ATP needed to unfold proteins to create structured water? Yeah. And then, also mitochondria are directly producing water, which is an energized state because the mitochondria also let off infrared light. So yeah, there's that aspect of it. So if people want to talk about diet, is it a diet creating metabolic health? Is it a lifestyle? Is it an environment creating healthy functioning mitochondria? And then inflammation, oxidative stress. So toxin exposure, are you stress, psychological stress? Are you giving your body signals to increase inflammation? Because sometimes we need to do that. If we get an injury,
traumatic stress. Yeah.
If we get an injury or we get, or something, we need to, inflammation is just the body's way of saying, okay, growth and repair. That's what we need from this. Even just exercise and challenging your muscles creates a little inflammation, growth and repair so that we come back stronger. Like we need that. But if it gets to be excess because we're too psychologically stressed out, our metabolism is very poor, or toxin exposure, endotoxemia, different types of things can cause too much inflammation. And then we're in this inflammatory state that's causing dysfunction. So we need to pay attention to that. So obviously reducing all the things that I talked about, like toxin exposure and stuff. And then autonomic nervous system. So it's the system in your body that's perceiving your environment through the senses. And we can argue how many senses there are. But I think there's more than just 5. And telling your body you're in a safe or threatening environment. And if you're in an environment that's always signaling your body that you're in a threatening environment, which may not be something that you actually are consciously aware of, like if you're walking down the street and you hear car horns, your mind can override, oh, that's not a threat. But your body is hearing that and having a stressful response to it, even if we're not reacting the way we would if we were, scared from someone jumping out behind a door or something.
Right.
And so just acknowledging that and that kind of stuff is all going to lead to balance or imbalance of the autonomic nervous system. And so if we're, people think that, oh, I'm in sympathetic or parasympathetic, I'm in stress or non-stress, whatever. And that's not the case. We're always getting signals of both. And they're supposed to balance each other out. Like if we have a surge of sympathetic stress reaction or whatever, there's always a smaller surge of parasympathetic non-stress to balance it out. And if that system gets off, like if we're suppressing that vagal tone, that parasympathetic, we're suppressing that because we're, for various reasons, whether there was an injury or past trauma or something like that, or we're just operating in this high stress state, then we get these stress signals without the concurrent, like the balancing non-stress. And that can send us into this kind of the spiral of always being in the stress state. It's always perceiving that we're in a stressful situation, even if we're not, because the body is just perceiving the environment. But humans are the only species on the planet I know that can think their way into a stress response.
Oh, yeah.
Because we could see something stressful happen to somebody else halfway across the world and fear it's going to happen to us, because of the news, thanks news, or whatever. We can have something stressful happen directly to us. And instead of, having the stress response, getting away from it and going back to homeostasis, we think about it the rest of the day.
Right.
Or we're being told that if you don't have enough money, this is going to happen. Or if this happens to your kids, this is going to happen. And it's just like all these different fear-based things that are driving up this stress response that's creating this imbalance. And, that's just kind of the state of the modern day, the modern world. And it's just unfortunate because, it's like, what do we do about it? It's like, well, we change our perception of stress. We understand our physiology. We put our body in as many different situations where we're getting a non-stress signal, so we can balance that out. We resolve past trauma, however we need to do that. We avoid toxins, we meditate, we do these things that change our perception of stress and give our body different signals. But I think that, that, and then like circadian health and quantum health are just a huge aspect of that, because if you're not, in sync with the day-night cycle, then your body's getting all kinds of stress signals, And I just had this conversation with my dad this morning, because he was like, I'm confused about circadian health. It's like, I can't go to bed at 4:30 or 5 o'clock. And I was like, you're not supposed to. You're supposed to align. You're supposed to align your body's thinking of when the sun is down and when it's up. So that means like when the sun comes up, you want your body to see that. So it says, okay, this is the time when the sun's coming up right now. And then when the sun goes down, minimize your artificial light so that your body knows the sun is down. You don't have to go to bed immediately when the sun goes down, but like give your body some signals at least that the sun is down, so that you can get on that cycle. Because being out of that cycle is very stressful to our autonomic nervous system. It creates the wrong signaling. And so yeah, it was just, I had to clarify that for him. And I was like, oh, I wonder if other people need to know that too. But yeah, so that's kind of the three imbalances. So you want to, that may be a lot for people. It's just like,
oh, I think it's great.
It's just like, those are the three imbalances that drive heart disease and pretty much all disease. And so you want to center your life around doing things that put yourself in an environment that create metabolic health, that decrease inflammation, and that balance the autonomic nervous system.
I love that. That's fantastic. And I'm sure you go into a lot more depth on those topics in your book, correct?
Definitely. Yeah. And more strategies and things like that, and things to implement.
Awesome. Well, I'll make sure I link that down in the show notes. And if people want to follow you, what's the best way to find your work?
Yeah, my website is resourcehealth.com. And that's where I run my health consulting off of that. My books are there, my blog is there. And then I'm on social media, just Instagram and Facebook and Twitter sometimes. Just Dr. Stephen Hussey, Dr. Stephen Hussey. And then my books are on Amazon. If people don't want to use Amazon, they can go to the publisher website or things like that, which is Chelsea Green Publishing. So yeah, people can find me on those places.
Perfect. Well, I'll make sure to link all of that in the show notes. And thank you so much for being here and chatting with me today.
Yeah, of course. My pleasure.